Have you ever thought that playing Trolldier is hard? Yeah, now think how hard it could be if you had no primary weapon to jump with, no boots to make air mobility easier, and on top of that had to aim for a specific half of your target's hitbox to get the critical hit. Well, that's probably the best way I can describe how difficult Surfstabs feel when you just start learning them. Luckily for you, I have spent far more time than it is reasonable to getting the hang of Surfstabs, not only to land them myself, but also to make them more approachable for less experienced players in the future. Hey, I'm John, and in this video I will be presenting everything I know about Surfstabs in a beginner-friendly manner, starting from the absolute basics and ending with some niche details and techniques that I bet that you, no matter how experienced you are, have not thought of before. However, before we start learning, I want to make sure that all of us are starting to learn in ideal conditions. You see, Surfstabs are already difficult. There is no need to make them even more difficult for yourself by, for example, having bad network settings. The difference between good and bad network settings might not be that apparent on other classes, but for a class that can be countered by the enemy just turning around, having the game feel as responsive on your end as it can possibly be is a must. To check your network settings, you can type net_graph1 in the console while in a game and read the number after the line that says Lerp. Having it higher than 15.2 basically means that there is more of a delay between what happens in the server and what you see, which can drastically change how difficult it will be to stab enemies or even react to certain visual cues when learning Surfstabs. Luckily, changing your network settings is as simple as entering these commands into your console when in the main menu, or adding them to your autoexec file before you start the game. Trust me, don't skip this one, it is a game changer. Also, I highly suggest upping your sensitivity to a point where you can do at least 1.5 360s over your mouse space, since Surfstabs require a lot of aerial control that is preferably smooth. If you want to keep lower sensitivity on everything else, for example, I still use lower sensitivity on my revolver to hit shots easier, you can do so by creating class-specific config files or just copying mine and changing the sensitivity values and binds as you wish. Download link to my config is in the description, so feel free to use it for yourself, but my config is kind of weird and you have been warned about it. Additionally, I have put download links to practice maps that I will mention in the description as well, that way you don't have to search for working map versions by yourself. Last thing that I feel like mentioning is that while being able to rocket jump is not mandatory, as you begin learning it helps out a lot. I personally suggest practicing it to at least a point where you can beat tier 2 maps such as Jump Academy easy without too much of an issue, since rocket jump maps at that point focus on rather basic skills, such as strafing without losing too much speed, keeping your strafes clean and so on. With all that out of the way, the preparation is done and we can start going over some theory. Since we are learning from the basics, I want to start by presenting the concept of overhead stabs as a whole, since a lot of things that apply to Surfstabs can also be learned by practicing other, far more common overhead stabs. Overhead stabs in concept are quite straightforward. Practically any stab in which you stab your enemy while being above them is an overhead stab. And even though some variations of Surfstabs happen without you being above the enemy, the general approach tends to be the same for the most part. The idea of overhead stabs is also as simple as, basically, you aim to go around the enemy and into them while strafing in the air instead of approaching your enemy in a straight line, which is more of a common approach by less experienced players. If you're jumping a competent player in a straight line, you're likely to just die, because going in a straight line is the opposite of dodging. By jumping directly at your enemy, you are often looking directly at them, which can make their danger alarm go off if they have one. By jumping to the side of your enemy and strafing back into them, you make that happen much later, if at all, which makes it much easier to get to the stabbing part of the jump so much more often. By approaching your enemy from the side, you also have the advantage of not needing to stop before the stab happens, and this might take a few lessons to figure it out. You see, if you jump straight over your enemy and you still have some height to fall before you reach them, you need to stop above them in order to land on them and not behind them. All the time you spend in the air without any horizontal mobility is a time during which the enemy can walk out from under you, and is also a time that we want to completely remove from your approach. By moving towards the enemy from the side, as I mentioned, we can change the angle of our approach. For example, when the enemy is close, we can go a bit wider to the enemy if we have more height to fall, to basically travel a longer distance while maintaining speed instead of slowing down and aiming to get that shorter distance but slower. After all, the time that it takes for you to directly fall down doesn't change depending on how quickly you are going forward, so if you have a chance to keep horizontal speed, that is always preferred. With this approach, you can also have a much easier time reacting and responding to the enemy trying to juke you out. For example, the most common way to juke an airborne enemy is to walk towards them and then walk away from them, trying to bait the enemy to slow down. This works because airborne players can change their movement direction as quickly and as rapidly as players on the ground can, and they also have a limited amount of speed. By walking towards the airborne enemy, we are presenting them with two threats. For one, if they don't slow down, we can just walk under them, which if we do while they are still in the air, we can just walk out of the reach. If they slow down too much, and then we start walking away from them, they just cannot reach us anymore, and since the airborne player doesn't have a chance to gain extra speed out of thin air quickly, baiting them to slow down just once is enough to ruin their entire approach most of the time. If you jump straight at the enemy, every direction they move to you have to either respond to with your strafes or slow down if they're getting too close, as I have already mentioned. When going around your opponent, you only really need to respond to whether they're going towards you or away from you by dividing their jukes this way. If they are walking away, you make your approach sharper. If they walk towards you, you make it more dull. If the enemy tries juking you with W and S or A and D, it won't require you to respond with the same or opposite button inputs. All you have to do is make sure that you keep going around them at an angle that doesn't let them walk under you, which means keeping your approach wide enough up until you're close and then turn sharper and land on them. While this may sound complicated and absolutely unnecessary, especially for stuff like stair stabs that are done at a close distance, don't worry about it. As mentioned, this kind of an approach lets you build good habits for Surfstabs while being just a bit more effective than the more usual direct approach of simple overhead stabs, and if you're not yet doing it, it's definitely not the end of the world. But I think that even the simpler reasons of not being a stationary target and not telegraphing what you're doing as much to the enemy players are reasons that make this approach worthwhile practicing. With the basic idea of overhead stabs covered, let me run you through my suggested way of practicing the entire process of Surfstabs from absolute zero, while applying the concepts of what we already know to the process itself. Doing such practice has helped a lot of players that I coached before to get their first Surfstabs with as little as a week's worth of simple practice, as well as generally get more comfortable with surfing damage as a whole. Also, I wanted to note that if you are ever interested in becoming one of the few players that I coach on such topics in the future, there will be an announcement at the end of the video that might interest you, but I will get to that when I get to that. Alright, as boring as it is, I always suggest starting to practice Surfstabs by practicing stair stabs with the correct, quote-unquote correct approach onto your walkway. Generally, I suggest setting bots to walk in a straight line and respawn every 2 seconds or so and just keep at it. There are two things you're aiming to get into your muscle memory for now. First, whenever you jump at your enemy, you want to make sure that you jump to their side and not at them if the map geometry allows it. If you're not comfortable with it, I highly recommend over-exaggerating your approach and tuning it down later to force your old habits away. Another thing is that when you land on your target, you might not want to immediately stab. Instead, I suggest practicing to continue spinning on top of your target without falling off. Personally, I found that doing this helped me to get a feeling for how to stop on top of the enemy by only using my strafe keys and the mouse, as well as how to quickly reach any side of my target if I ever chose to do so in any situation. Also, learning that prevents you from jumping too much to the back of your opponent, which if you do, you are making an opening for the enemy to juke you by simply turning around, resulting in a missed stab. Obviously, I feel the need to mention that this is TR Walkway. I only recommend practicing this to get the mechanical feel for any kind of stab. Even if you can consistently hit stabs here, you will need to account for baiting your enemies as well as judging the general situation in real games before you start landing trick stabs there. TR Walkway won't make you good at them. It will only lower how many stabs you will fail because of the mechanical skill issue. For example, not turning around as soon as you should get a stab, or forgetting to crouch when in the air, or so on. It's only for muscle memory and understanding the general concept. The next practicing stage I recommend is the simplest form of Surfstabs that you can try for. Surfstabs and TR Walkway. For that, make all the bots play soldier, make them shoot as often as they can, give them ammo regeneration, and give yourself some health by using the command hurt me and then a negative value. For example, hurt me negative 10,000 or 100,000. I personally turn on the firewall as well to make sure I have a steady supply of bots coming my way and go from there. When practicing this, you basically want to divide it into 3 parts. First, you focus on getting a good surf as often as you can. Then you focus on landing on top of the enemy by going slightly around and into them. And lastly, the stab itself. Let me cover each part in greater detail. When it comes to surfing rockets, you want to start by judging where the rocket is going to hit the ramp. Since we left the bots aiming directly forward, it will be a consistent height, so you don't have to worry about reading the bots too much, because it's going to be always the same. Now, a mistake almost every beginner I see making is just standing there when the rocket hits you or simply just jumping in place. Instead, you should be aiming to walk into the surf, because the velocity you get from the rocket adds onto your walking velocity to create a more powerful surf that's going to give you far more distance. Luckily, you don't need to walk for too long to reach max walking speed, so it can be as simple as pressing W for a bit just before you get hit by the rocket. Naturally, the timing of your jump, which should be executed by pressing crouch and jump at the same time, also matters. Luckily, it's simple to understand. If you get hit by the rocket as you're going up from your jump, you will get launched well. If you get hit as you're falling down from your jump, you will get launched far less, since the velocity of the rocket will have to work against your current velocity instead of working with it. Now, this wouldn't be a guide if I didn't tell you that that's actually a good thing. When practicing Surfstabs, there is a sweet spot of height that you want to practice hitting, since you want to land on your target as soon as you reach them. For example, if your target is very close, jumping early to get launched lower by the rocket can be optimal. As a general rule of thumb, high surfs towards the target that shot you are not that good. Why? Because the higher we get, the more airtime we have before we reach our target, which means that they have more time to react to us and try to juke us. For that reason, if you ever have to choose between going for high up surfs and quick and low surfs, going quick and low should be the preferred way, unless you're trying to go for cool clips. However, going a bit too high is always preferred than going a bit too low, since we don't necessarily want to hit our opponent's hitbox and just not manage to get on top of them. That's why going a little bit higher is always better than going a little bit lower. I just mentioned surfs that are low because I want you to avoid going for surfs that are very high up, but don't have a lot of horizontal velocity. So to recap, you should be aiming to walk into your surf, crouch jump into it, and avoid going too high up. You also might see that I apply the idea of going around and into the target even before I get to being in the air in my surf examples. Such an approach, where I jump to the side of the opponent already instead of going directly straight at them, lets me adjust my airborne trajectory with minimal strafing. Personally, I practiced all of these things as well as the further exercises at 1.5 and 2 times speed of the game by using the command host_timescale and then the respective speed. Since, as the God Almighty Swipes has once said, if you want to play like a machine, you need to train like a machine. So I did. And I can tell you that it lowered the amount of surfstabs and stairstabs that I missed by quite a bit in the long run. However, I only suggest doing that after you are consistent at doing those stabs at normal speed, because playing on a fast speed should enhance your muscle memory, not build it. With all of this, we are done with the easy part of the practice. Everything up until this point was practiced on stationary or predictable targets in a very controlled environment. That's why diving directly into casual games is not recommended just yet, since TR Walkway, even on 2 times speed, is mere basics. Even getting a surf, let alone a stab, can take hours of playing casual if you've never done it before, since you have to take a lot of things into consideration, such as your health, other players shooting to kill you. Hell, even positioning yourself decently for a surf can take a long time just for the enemy player to ignore you and for you to just die from a sniper headshot or something. Or worse, get random crit and see your corpse fly across the map. Luckily, I have a way to practice surfstabs that are as hard, or at times even harder than surfstabs in casual, with no inconsistency of casual included. That, my friends, is TR Newbots. Basically, it's a practice map designed for deathmatch skills with a conveniently good soldier bot, which is perfect for practicing spy of all things. Here's how. Setting the map up is practically the same as setting up TR Walkway if you've ever done it. You enter the necessary command, which I'll put on the screen, you give the bots regeneration of health and ammo. I would advise doing that if you're experienced with reload timings and you don't need to practice it. Otherwise, just play around with it, that way you don't get into a consistent rhythm. In case you decide not to give the soldier ammo regeneration, eventually he's going to swap to shotgun. You might just want to use the kill command on the soldier, that way you don't need to gun the soldier down every single time when he runs out of rocket launcher ammo. Alright, now that we got to this area, there are a few rules we want to follow. Generally, you want to approach the bot at medium range. Being too far will make you not surf close enough to the bot. Being too close might not make him shoot you, because if he sees that he's going to get damaged by the rocket, he delays his rockets, which makes it much harder to count them. Other than that, you want to apply all the same ideas that you did in TR Walkway, with one small addition. Since the soldier will be aiming to shoot you, not to set you up with a surf like the soldiers in TR Walkway, you need to approach him properly to make the surf happen. Technically, you can do that by juking rockets, then stopping. That makes you predictable. The soldier shoots a rocket directly at your feet, and you can kind of surf it as if you did it in your walkway, except now you're on even ground and not the slope. However, the more useful idea to have is to approach the enemy by going to their side. If any soldier is shooting direct rockets at you, and they don't track you that well, they will just miss the shot. Good soldiers that shoot the ground will most of the time aim to where you will be when they expect to hit you, not where you are now, since it's obviously a projectile weapon. Because of that, you can change your moving directions and still close the distance between the soldier, even if you're not counting their firing times to bait them and whatnot. If the soldier shoots a very surfable rocket, you don't need to adjust your direction much, since you'll already be going around them, so you just get a smooth surf, land on them and stab. Alright, that's for the most part it. Everything else you do will boil down to more practice. Personally, I struggle to even get a single Surfstab in Newbots for the first few days, but getting a feeling for it is all that it takes. Within a month of getting a few Surfstabs in Newbots a day, I went to hitting 10s without that much time spent, and eventually to hitting over 100 in single Newbots sessions. The reason you can do that is because while the bot is difficult to Surfstab, it is consistently difficult. It rarely misses simple rockets, it punishes you for being too predictable by airshotting you, it backs away if you surf too wide, it goes under if you surf too straight. You get the point. For the most part, you can't go from not attempting any Surfstabs to hitting them in just a few days, especially if you have been playing Spy in a playstyle that focuses on chains or on more passive gun spying. Getting many Surfstabs will require you to approach certain situations differently than you usually would, since going for Surfstabs is a playstyle all by itself. Newbots is only a way to work up your confidence, to even put yourself in those positions to begin with. So, at this point in time, to get the best results, you would have to mix and match two practices at once. Practice the optimal approach to Surfstabs in the semi-controlled environment of Newbots, and fish for Surfstabs when playing casual. First and foremost, you need to choose what maps you play wisely. You can't just play 2 Fort and Turbine expecting to learn surfs quickly, if at all. The best maps for practicing surfs are quite open, usually with high skyboxes and plenty of flank routes. For example, Payload Odyssey and Phoenix meet all of the requirements and even have a feature that makes surfing damage even easier. They have a lot of height differences around the map, which means you can approach enemies by standing on a slope, just like in TR Walkway, which makes surfing damage even easier, as you might have noticed when practicing between Walkway and Newbots. Other things to consider are general sentry spots on the map, especially if you're playing on the blue team. Having sentries in open maps is something that kills a lot of rocket and sticky surfs in the area, since to surf damage you need to be undisguised. For example, while maps like Butternubs have a lot of areas to surf in, they are quite often denied by sentries, so trying to surf becomes quite silly. Last thing about maps is that the best maps to practice in as a Surfstab rookie would be Halloween maps when they are around. Naturally, they have a lot of extra chaos that is hard to read, but they also have pumpkin bombs, which is the objectively easiest way to get Surfstabs. Technically, you can also play Bread Space or some Christmas maps when they are around, since they also have surfable explosives, but it's practically the same thing. When practicing in those maps, you basically want to get overhealed and then just go for a pumpkin surf. If you see surfable soldiers or demos, that's good, but having pumpkins allows you to practice in every single game. After deciding on a map, you should think what playstyle you want to practice in. Generally, the best well-rounded loadout for all skill levels when surf fishing is Invis Watch with a kunai and a l'étranger. Basically, it's the loadout that makes flanking as well as positioning as easy as it can be, as well as maximizing your health as long as you can get stabs with that loadout. The popular loadout though is Kunai with Deadringer, and if paired with L'Étranger it can still be very effective. I would suggest playing Invis loadout first, and then swap to the Deadringer if flanking without forcing the Deadringer through the enemy team can be done reliably, since if you always waste your Deadringer to get behind the enemy, you might as well just use the cloak that does a better job at it. Also, Gunspy is a semi-viable option for Surfstabs, and you can practice with it, but I would not recommend it too much, since with 125 health you get one surf attempt most of the time and that's it. That is the general idea on loadouts, and I needed to share it since now I will be explaining different situations on how to fish for surfs in your regular games. For that, I will be explaining it with the assumption that you're using the kunai, because kunai is one of the only knives that benefit from successful surf stabs as much as regular stabs. You just look cooler with it when you do it. With all the other knives, surf stabbing is objectively worse than getting a regular backstab, since surfs tend to take away a lot of your health. I hope that is clear enough on why I went through the loadouts. Now I think I had enough of dry theory, so I'll try to explain how I fish for surfs with actual examples. First, before the game even starts, I am already looking out for surfable players. If it's the warm-up, you can judge the enemy soldiers on whether they shoot straight or at the ground, you can judge whether their demos use stickies or pipes, all that good stuff, but you don't need to do that. Honestly, you can just cycle through your disguises before the game starts to find a player that seems surfable, and that will do. Generally, I choose my quote-unquote surf setter for the start of the game purely based on what weapons they're using, since some weapons are just easier to surf than others. For example, a soldier with gunboats or banners will always be easier to surf than a soldier that has access to a shotgun. I'll go more in detail about some weapon surfing quirks later, but for now just look for something that seems doable to you. Once you have decided on a surf setter, or multiple, I don't judge, all you need to do is aim to play around them whenever possible. The idea being that if you get stabbed with a kunai next to them and they shoot you, you will always have enough health to surf them. But before you start to surf the rocket towards them, you should heavily consider surfing it towards another target if there is one. Surf stabbing the enemy that shoots you will always be harder than surfing away and stabbing someone else, since the person that is shooting you is almost always aware of you and is likely already tracking you, which means that they will be juking you. So, if you have a chance to take the easy way out and surf stab someone else that's maybe not even aware of you, do that. Once you do, turn back to your surf setter and go again. As you get better at surf stabs, you don't stab the surf setter to maximize the amount of surfs you can get, one after another, not because it's hard to stab the aware player. All I'm saying is that just because we practice the harder variations of surf stabs into your Newbots doesn't mean that you shouldn't take the easy way out if you see one, especially since it allows you to recycle the surfs. Naturally, if the person you are using for the job is perfect, just keep at it. But here's how to work around some player quirks and habits to surf more efficiently and maybe to have more fun. First, if you find that your target isn't that aware of spies, you might want to start gun baiting a little bit more. Basically, if you have the health to surf damage and you're in a good position for it, but the enemy isn't aware of you, you can shoot them once or twice while standing still in hopes that they will turn around and shoot you. Personally, before I shoot them, I aim to position myself better for a surf. For example, if the enemy is too close, I walk back a few steps to create enough distance for myself to react to the enemy rockets. If you find that your target isn't hitting you at all, maybe their reaction time is a little bit slow or their aim isn't very good, standing still before they shoot you or even as they reload can make the surf still happen. Obviously, don't do this if you have 10 people shooting you at once, but if it's just the enemy player, I find that it works like a charm. If the enemy soldier shoots rockets directly at you, rather than the ground, positioning yourself on a slope or a high ground or some stairs can make it easier to surf rockets. You can also use walls to surf such rockets, but I personally find slopes to be easier to surf consistently. Sometimes you might notice that the enemy player has no interest of shooting you. Occasionally that will happen if they feed you some surfs and realize that they shouldn't do that, but more often than not, it's the result of you telegraphing your intent just a little bit too much. If you, as a spy player, catch yourself jumping around soldiers just waiting for a rocket to hit you, or jumping around preemptively in ranges in which you can react to rockets, consider not doing it so much anymore, because it's an old game and Surfstabs are not a new trick. People can know what you're doing and can aim to prevent it. Naturally, people sometimes won't shoot you if they don't see you as a threat, so if your surf setter is reluctant to shoot you and instead leaves you for their team to deal with, try stabbing them once or twice regularly. I find that it encourages people to play more aggressively since nobody likes dying to a spy too much. Just don't do it too much since often people just swap to pyro. You have been warned. These were probably the most common quirks I see players have. Obviously, there are more of them, but I can't really cover every single situation for you, and even if I could, I wouldn't. The fact is, while I can explain things with less subjective best approach, the way you want to approach the people that you're fishing for surfs from varies from game to game and from player to player. All I can give you are some suggestions, but without seeing you play real time, I would rather encourage you to use your head instead of giving you advice that applies only 50% of the time or so. However, if you have more specific questions, you can drop by in my Discord. I, as well as other experienced spies there, will be more than happy to help you. To get more applicable general advice, let me explain reactive surfs and preemptive surfs and how they changed based on weapons that you surf. Knowing when to react to surf sources and when to try predicting them is as simple as learning projectile travel speeds and your own reaction time. On paper, you can just draw a circle around the enemy player, let's say a soldier in this case. Inside of the circle is a range that you cannot react to the rocket if it's fired at any random time to surf it well, and on the outside is the range at which you can react to it. So depending on how close you are to the enemy, you'll have to go from reacting to their projectiles to jumping preemptively by counting reload or firing speeds. It is very similar to practicing air blast on pyro, honestly. If you see the rocket coming from a mile away, you can reflect it with ease, but at very close distances, you will have to press the button of reflecting before you even see the rocket leave the rocket launcher. Luckily, learning this isn't all that difficult, it just takes a little bit of thinking. For example, when you're gunbaiting players for surfs, you always want to react to the rocket if possible, so you position accordingly, but if you just got to stop next to the player you can surf, you'll have to rely on your game sense rather than reaction time. When it comes to it, different weapons have different ranges at which you will have to change how you approach them. For example, for the sticky bombs, the react and predict areas are inverted since the demo man cannot detonate stickies at close range, which means you react to them and step on them rather than needing to predict anything, but at long ranges you will have to guess when the demo will detonate them. For other weapons, it can be much simpler. Weapons like the Liberty Launcher, you need to approach preemptively from a bit farther since the rocket travels faster. Scottish Resistance gives you a lot of time to stand on it before surfing, and so on. However, there are some weapons that may require an entirely different approach, and here is a few of them. The Beggar's Bazooka, you should always be approaching from reactive range, since for one, the soldier can just hold more rockets in and explode you without giving you a surf at a close range, and also the rockets have some unpredictable deviation which can mess with your surfs. To surf melee damage, you want to crouch jump next to a player and time their melee swing to hit you at the peak of your jump. If you do it and it's not a crit hit, then you tend to get just enough height to get above the player that hit you or their teammate, but not much more. If it is a critical hit, however, you tend to fly high up in the air with practically no horizontal mobility, unless you start backing away as they hit you, but even then it can be quite unpredictable. And for that, melee surfs shouldn't be really fished for, quote unquote. They are more of a last resort thing if you see no other out in a situation. To maximize your success, all melee weapons are best surfed around walls in tighter places. Since melee surfs tend to knock you away but don't give you enough distance or height to surf back on the enemy naturally, you can use walls to make sure you don't get knocked away too much and still reach them, as well as use the ceiling to control the surf height and make the stab happen faster. On a similar note, the direct hit should be treated more as a crit melee surf rather than any projectile surfs, since most soldiers aim to hit you directly, not the ground. Same goes for the lock and load, so I will just lump them both together here. If you're on even ground, you're best off crouch jumping next to or away from the soldier or the demo, depending on where you want to surf to. That way, if the enemy is aiming at the general mass of your character model, you can make the rocket hit you lower on your hitbox, which will give you more height. The loose cannon is not reliable to surf. You can hope that the demo detonates it with full charge at close range, but loose cannon surfs will mostly be random, and you should aim to juke the weapon rather than surf it. Almost the last weapon that I really find funny to surf is the rocket jumper. You can't necessarily surf it directly per se because it does no damage, but you can position yourself above the enemy soldier that jumps a lot with the rocket jumper to steal their velocity from each jump. Obviously, that's not going to be happening a lot, but if you just see somebody with the rocket jumper that's maybe new, or maybe somebody that's not necessarily aware of your existence, you can just jump above them. If they jump, you get launched high up in the air. If they don't jump, you just get a regular stair stab or a jump stab, so it works out perfect. When approaching your enemy, chances are that you won't always start at a perfect position to go for a surf. Sometimes you want to be closer, sometimes farther away from the enemy. Generally, there are two things you can then do. If you have enough health, just walk farther and tank a hit before surfing the damage at a better range. It works great if combined with an undisguised bind, since you can keep your disguise to not get knocked back for all the incoming damage before the initial surf. I, however, find this unreliable. You never know when an incoming hit that you don't want to surf will be a crit and just kill you before you even have an attempt at it. Instead of tanking hits, I suggest practicing to juke your enemies until you get to a good position, even if it means you take a second or two longer to get there. Honestly, juking as a whole is a good practice regardless of how you play Spy, since being able to not get hit as much as often increases your survivability, which is never a bad thing. However, since juking can be a complicated topic and it's already been covered before, I won't be covering it from A to Z. Instead, if you want to understand juking better, I put links to helpful guides from Slurgy and Leoty and myself in the description. Here, however, I will be showing some examples of juking and how I apply it for Surfstabs, but not juking as a whole. As explained before, I use juking to put myself to a better position for surfs. For example, in this situation I am on a slope, and surfing away from the soldier isn't really an option that would lead to a stab. Naturally, I can walk backwards and try baiting the soldier into me, but because my team is behind me, it is very likely that he wouldn't walk into me anyway. That's why I try to make him back away by pretending to get close multiple times, since if we get out of the doorway, I will be in a very open area, which will let me do a proper surf. All I really did there was count his rocket shooting timing and change directions when I think he will shoot, as simple as that. However, there is another situation where juking is crucial when fishing for surfs: baiting out the weapons that you want the enemy to use. There are two main methods that I use to do it. First, you can simply make the enemy run out of clip ammo in their other weapon. Otherwise, you can go to a range at which the desired weapon is more likely to be used. For example, everyone has their melee range. If you want the enemies to use their melee, you can't play around long range and expect it to work, unless you're playing against a demo knight. For example, in this situation, I gunbait the demo from mid-range with hopes to get a sticky surf, since if I do, I can surf towards both spawns. Unfortunately, since I am quite close to the demo starts shooting me with pipes, which I am forced to juke. I end up juking the pipes until he runs out, and as he does, I force him into melee range to scare him away, since he was backing away from me as I approached him every time. This results in him backing away quite far back, especially since I put myself farther away too, and he ends up swapping to stickies because the pipes were just not working at medium range, so long range is even more of a hassle. At this point, I just need to read or react his sticky placements, which I get right on the second attempt, and I am good to go. Honestly, there's not much of an objective way of learning that I can give you other than paying attention to it, since some players swap to their melee weapons as a preparation to entering their melee range. Some swap after you do enter their range, so you can understand that it varies per player, and predicting or noticing it comes with time and experience. Talking about experience, learning to take all of this into consideration will take a lot of failing. You'll fail surfing, strafing, landing, stabbing, practically whatever you can fail, you probably will before getting it right. However, failing a surf doesn't always have to result in a failed stab or death. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, there are ways to know when your surf isn't going to go anywhere, and there are ways to recover yourself from a failed surf stab as well. As I've explained before, the easiest way to know if your surf stab isn't going to land is seeing if at any point you cross over your opponent while still high up in the air. If you do, and the opponent is walking the opposite way from where you're surfing, it's not probable that you'll be able to land on them, since they can just walk out of your range before you get to turn around. In that case, you can just land in a good position and try to go for a second surf if you have the health, or just surf away to escape the situation. If the enemy doesn't capitalize on the fact that they just crossed you under, or if you manage to turn around well enough to spiral around them, you can recover the surf that way. But the faster the enemy is, and the faster they react, the harder that will be. Obviously, there will be times when the surf won't go your way. Maybe you will slow down too much during your surf, maybe you will not slow down enough, or the surf will just be too weak. Doesn't really matter. As long as there are enemies around you, you can probably still land an assisted surf stab. Technically, surf assisted stab works better, but ASS is more memorable than SAS as an abbreviation, so yeah. Whether you mess up your surf's angle, or just get launched randomly in a way you didn't expect to be, you can still turn the speed that you gain from that into an advantage. For example, if you fly quickly to the side of your opponent, you can either just get a side stab if they turn slowly, or step back and secure a matador if they turn quickly. In a similar manner, you can build speed from heavies, scouts, or sentries, or practically any hit scan or even projectile weapon while running away from them to build extra speed and then stab anyone along the way. Otherwise, you can just use a damage surf to go over someone else's field of view or around the doorway, which might not be a common thing to do, but it works really well if you have a pumpkin laying around in Halloween maps or if you have someone spam the door with rockets or stickies. When it comes to it, you will not be able to react to every single damage source in the game, and sooner or later you will get launched in a way you're not anticipating. It is such situations that force you to act not from theory that you know, but almost entirely from feeling, and to develop that feeling, you need hours upon hours of practice. Alright, with that we have come to an end. And no, we have not. We have come to the end of general information that I find to be relevant as you're just starting to get used to regular Surfstabs. Even though I could end the video here, I still want to cover some things that can elevate your Surfstabs to another level. If you're not comfortable with Surfstabs yet, I would advise you to treat the rest of the video as a showcase of how Surfstabs are being pushed to their limits nowadays. If you're watching this as an experienced spy, however, I would love to hear some feedback on all of this, since I would love to see how we, as spy players, can push spy to its limits. To begin with, let me cover some stuff about aerials. Aerials, for those who don't know, are basically Surfstabs, but instead of landing on a grounded target, you stab someone that is already in the air. Generally, it is also agreed that the person you stab has to be launched in the air by damage as well, whether that would be rocket jumping or stuff like pyro jetpacks. Also, technically, shield crimping and other mobility sources can also count as aerials, but it's kind of a 50-50. For the most part, aerials happen not intentionally. More often than not, you will just be surfing with a high up surf towards an objective or the enemy spawn, and will just get lucky with an enemy entering your airspace. If you manage to strafe it out, you get yourself an aerial stab. Naturally, aerials are far more difficult than Surfstabs, not only because they're more random, but also because you have more stuff to account for, since the other player in the air can be going up, down, as well as sideways, depending on which part of the jump you approach each other from. Aside from such luck-based aerials though, there are a few situations that you can turn into aerial stab attempts quite reliably. And by reliably, somewhat often, because it's still quite a lot luck-based. First, if you ever see a soldier or a demo with a base jumper on the enemy team, it is your lucky day. Most of the players that use that weapon just hang in the air, and all you really need to do is just find a damage source to launch yourself towards them, which is made even easier since the only classes that can use the base jumper are the two projectile classes in the game. Soldiers that dive bomb you will be the main source of practice when it comes to aerials. You have probably seen quite a few such aerials performed around, especially if the enemy soldier does a so-called pencil jump and just shoots directly down at the spy. As a spy, all you have to do in such a situation is just let the rocket hit the ground and not your face, and aim yourself to reach the enemy soldier as you crouch jump, and you get the stab. However, if the soldiers around you aren't doing pencil jumps, you can try baiting aerials out of them. In general, if you ever have a soldier at a low ground, even if it's not a high up one, you can get the soldier's attention and back away from the ledge of the high ground. I find that doing so makes the soldier jump towards you or ignore you, since they don't have a clear way of fighting you with the rockets directly. If they ignore you, you keep shooting them to incentivize the jump, but when they eventually react to you and they jump you, You can try going for an aerial if they bomb you, and if they don't, they will likely shoot a rocket at you eventually, which you can then use for a regular Surfstab, so it's still a win-win situation for you. The last situation, which you can kind of expect an aerial from, is when you are backpedaling a soldier and he shoots the ground, so both of you kind of get a small rocket jump more or less to the same direction. To be fair, it shouldn't be your goal to get an aerial like this, it's not very likely nor very practical, but it is something that does happen from time to time, you just have to react to it. Other than that, aerials will probably be quite random. If you have more situations where you get attempts at aerials at least somewhat consistently, please do share so in the comments. Otherwise, that's it about them from me. Next, I have two neat little tricks with Sentry surfs. If the map you are in has a high skybox and you want to surf back onto the Sentry, you can undisguise and immediately redisguise as you surf to not get shot as you land. Naturally, this can be done if you leave the Sentry's range and go back into it any other way. It doesn't have to be going up. If the map has some surfable geometry or clip brushes that let you surf away and then kind of boomerang back into the Sentry, this applies as well. If you don't leave the range of the Sentry, you can still use this to land on the ground, since even though the Sentry will be shooting you, your disguise will prevent you from taking knockback from it. Another neat trick is turning C-tap stabs into Sentry surfs. Since C-tap stabs give you extra height, if you get one next to a Sentry as it's looking at you, you can surf the Sentry at a higher angle, which can net you a Surfstab or even an aerial on your way down. One problem with this is that getting a C-tap stab can already be hard. This way, you would also have to stab on the correct time, as the Sentry is looking in your direction. Also, you would have to jump away from the Sentry, because jumping towards it would make a Sentry surf not really good. If the Sentry is looking away as you're going for a C-tab in its range, it will take for it a second to turn around and lock onto you, at which point if you did it too early while it was looking too far away, you will be on the ground. Technically, one way to deal with this would be to get the Sentry to lock onto you as you jump. You can undisguise, C-tap stab and surf away in that order, but that takes practice to get down and even luck depending on how far the Sentry is, so it should really only be done for style points. Doing it the other way around, going for a surf and then a C-tap, is far more difficult, and the only real advice I can give you is that you should definitely use a macro and not a bind for that, since I find that the bind is much slower, which can make or break such a high pressure surf. In terms of your surfing trajectory, you might want to change it up a bit if you know that you're planning to go for a C-tap stab, since instead of stabbing instantly as you land, you want to land and then walk on top of your enemy before you stab, which means that landing more on the opponent's front half actually makes sense for once. Unfortunately, I am not qualified in C-taps more to give proper advice, but honestly, if you've even attempted for such stabs, or even gotten them, you shouldn't need tips from me anyway, so it's not the end of the world. And I think that concludes it. If you are still here, I sincerely want to thank you for watching so far into the video, since I have put more time and effort into this video than I want to admit. The fact is, for every single topic that I present on this channel, I aim not only to learn the things myself, but also to coach a few other players on the same topics, since I only want to present it in a way that I know can be understood and followed by less experienced players. If you ever want to have a chance to participate in that, as in to be coached by me personally on a topic I will be presenting in the future, the Discord server is in the description. Honestly, big shout out to Phil and Fizz for volunteering this time around. Over the past few months, I have watched Fizz put hours into practicing Surfstabs. Within a few months, he has gone from never even attempting Surfstabs to feeling comfortable going for Surfstabs, even if they don't work out all the time, which makes it very entertaining to watch at times. If you ever feel interested to check him out, his Twitch link is in the description as well. On the same note, I want to thank every single player that helped me make this video into what it is, whether that would be by teaching me or asking me questions or helping me with the editing part of it. Namely, I want to thank Mu, the OG Surfstab spy, for lending me a hand and giving me some insight as someone who has been good at Surfstabs for far longer than I have even played the class for. Same goes for Bernie regarding C-tabs. And at last, I want to thank you all for supporting what I do. Reaching 1000 subscribers is quite something, so genuinely, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day.